Hello everyone, tonight we're going to talk about something that might make you look twice at every lighthouse you ever see. Imagine this: the rain is falling sideways, like the wind itself is trying to shove the ocean onto the land. The entire shoreline of Greywater Cove is swallowed by fog, and the only light you can see is a pale, flickering beam sweeping from the old lighthouse on the cliff. The strange part: that lighthouse has been abandoned for over 30 years. A storm like this can make your skin prickle, even if you're sitting warm inside. For the people of Greywater Cove, though, this storm wasn't just weather. It was a warning, the kind they'd heard before but never dared to speak about openly. And on this night, something happened that would lodge itself into the town's history like salt into a wound. A fisherman, Thomas Hale, would vanish before the storm passed. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're at the very beginning, standing in the howling wind, looking at the eerie white flash of the lighthouse beam, trying to figure out why it feels like it's watching us instead of the other way around. This isn't just a ghost story, and it isn't just a crime story. It's both tangled together like seaweed caught in a propeller. A real man disappeared, and in his place, the town inherited a mystery that would pull up old secrets like a dredging net. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and maybe even what you do. Who knows? You might just meet a neighbor in the replies. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The storm had rolled in just after sundown. Locals described the wind as knife-edged, cutting straight through your clothes and into your bones. The gulls had vanished hours earlier, the harbor was deserted, and the fishing boats that hadn't been brought ashore were rocking in place like nervous animals. From the high road leading to the cliff, you could see the skeleton silhouette of the lighthouse, framed in jagged bolts of lightning. Its beam didn't sweep smoothly like modern lights. It twitched, hesitated, then jumped as if it were malfunctioning. The weird thing was there was no power to that building. The cables had been cut decades ago after the last keeper died. Some of the older folks in Greywater Cove remembered that keeper, a quiet man named Elias Stroud. They said he had the habit of keeping logs that didn't just track tides and storms, but also odd movements along the shoreline, things that never made it into the official Coast Guard reports. When Elias died in 1972, the light was shut down and the building sealed. Except it seemed for nights like this. Around 9 p.m., Martha Crowley, who lived in a house just inland from the cliff, noticed the light first. She called her neighbor, a retired Coast Guard named Henry Clark, and asked him if maybe the town had decided to restore the beacon. Henry said no. In fact, he sounded uneasy, told her to lock her doors, draw her curtains, and stay the hell away from the water. But in a small town like this, telling people to stay away is basically telling them to come look. By 10 p.m., a handful of locals had gathered at the bluff, watching that ghostly light cut through the fog. One of them was a younger man named Peter, who swore he saw movement inside the lantern room, just a shadow pacing back and forth. This was when the first strange sound was reported. Several people heard a deep, resonant horn, not from any boat, but from the cliff itself. It was low, almost mournful, and seemed to make the rocks vibrate. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this sound was atmospheric, some kind of wind resonance, or something mechanical from deep inside the old structure. But no one's managed to replicate it since. It was during this eerie moment that a small boat was spotted far below, heading out into the open water despite the storm intensifying. A couple of the onlookers recognized it as the sea mare belonging to Thomas Hale. At the time, no one thought too much of it. Thomas was known for being stubborn about fishing schedules, storm or no storm, But later, when the boat would return without him, this sighting would take on a darker meaning. The lightning grew more violent, the rain heavier. Most of the group scattered for shelter. By midnight, the cliff was empty, except perhaps for whoever or whatever was inside the lighthouse. And by dawn, Thomas Hale was gone. When the first light of morning broke over Greywater Cove, it didn't so much illuminate the town as it did expose it wet, battered, and hung over from the storm's rage. The fishing docks were a mess. Ropes had snapped, barrels had rolled into the water, and a couple of smaller boats had been tossed up onto the rocks like toys. But the sea mare, that was the one everyone noticed. She was back tied to her usual spot at Pier 3, bobbing gently as if nothing had happened. The problem? There was no sign of Thomas Hale. Peter, the same young man who'd seen Thomas heading out into the storm, was one of the first down at the docks. He described the scene in a way that still makes people uneasy. The boat was dry inside, no puddles, no rainwater, like someone had wiped it down after the storm. But it reeked of brine, like it had been deep out at sea. And then there was the other detail: the nets were still full, but the fish were gone. Torn open guts gone, as if something had gutted them mid-haul. The harbour master called the Coast Guard immediately. They ran a quick search, starting from where Thomas was last seen. The weather had calmed enough for a helicopter, and for hours they swept the coastline. Not a scrap of clothing, not a life jacket, nothing. That same morning, Martha Crowley decided to take her dog up near the cliff to check for storm damage. As she approached the path, she froze. Lying there in the mud about 20 yards from the old lighthouse was a single boot, worn, scuffed and filled with water, but unmistakably Thomas Hale's. She knew because Thomas had once complained about how expensive those boots were and how he'd never buy another pair until the sea stole them off my feet. It was at this point that Sheriff Leonard Briggs, Greywater Cove's reluctant lawman, stepped into the picture. Briggs was the kind of sheriff who'd rather break up bar fights than deal with anything that smelled like a real mystery. But he had to admit, something about the scene felt wrong. The boot wasn't on the cliff path proper, it was on the slope, as if someone had slipped or been dragged toward the lighthouse. And here's the part that still gets brought up in town gossip. There were no other footprints, not even dog prints, which made Martha swear she'd been walking her dog the whole way. The sheriff posted a notice at the general store asking for any information about Thomas's whereabouts. That's when the stories started to trickle in. A woman named Claire Denton, who lived in a cottage overlooking the cove, claimed she'd been awake during the worst of the storm and heard something odd, a faint voice calling for help. Not from the sea, but from the cliffs near the lighthouse. She didn't go check, because in her words, there's nothing up there but stones and ghosts. And then there was old Henry Clark, the retired Coast Guard. He reluctantly admitted he'd been watching the lighthouse through binoculars during the night. He said he saw the light flicker erratically, then settle into a steady beam, not sweeping, just fixed. And in that fixed beam he swore he saw two silhouettes, one tall and still one moving frantically. He didn't think it could be Thomas, not at first, but when the second figure suddenly vanished from view, Henry put his binoculars down and refused to look again. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these accounts are reliable eyewitness reports or just storm-induced misinterpretations. But here's a strange historical fact. Back in 1934, another fisherman had vanished during a storm almost exactly like this one. His boat was found intact, moored in the harbour with no sign of a struggle, just a single boot on the cliff near the same lighthouse. Coincidence, or something older, woven into the bones of Greywater Cove? By nightfall, the official search for Thomas had turned up nothing. The storm was gone, but the air still felt electric like static before a lightning strike. The lighthouse, now dark again, stood silent against the fading sky. Peter, restless and uneasy, made a decision. He would go up there himself. Peter didn't tell anyone what he was planning. He knew they'd try to talk him out of it. By the time the sun was sliding into the water-painting Greywater Cove in streaks of blood orange and bruised purple, he was already halfway up the winding path to the lighthouse. The trail was slick from the storm. Every step was a gamble. The mud tried to pull his boots off, the wind caught at his jacket like an impatient hand. But Peter's mind wasn't on the path. It was on Thomas, his laugh, his stubborn streak, and the fact that Peter had been the last one to see him alive. That thought felt like a responsibility, and maybe a curse. The lighthouse loomed above him now, its white paint weathered to grey, its top glass cracked from years of neglect. Officially, the light hadn't been in service for decades, but every local knew the truth. Sometimes, on certain nights, it still lit up. No one could ever explain why. When Peter reached the top of the path, he saw it, the boot. Martha had been right. The leather was warped and salt-stained, the laces frayed. He crouched down to get a better look. There was something inside seaweed, still damp. It was strange because the boot was on the land side of the slope, far from the waves. A sudden gust made him glance toward the lighthouse door. It was ajar, just enough to show a sliver of darkness within. Thomas. His voice sounded too loud in the wind. No answer. Peter stepped forward, boots crunching on wet gravel. The air near the lighthouse had a different quality, colder, heavier, as if it was carrying something unspoken. He hesitated at the threshold hand on the old iron handle. The door groaned as it opened, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the hollow interior. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Not the damp, musty scent he expected, but brine, fresh, sharp like the inside of a fish market at dawn. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, picking out the narrow spiral stairs. They seemed steeper than they had any right to be, each step slick with moisture. Halfway up, Peter froze. There was a sound, soft, deliberate, like something being dragged across stone. It came from above him, maybe the lantern room. He called Thomas's name again. This time there was an answer. It was faint, distorted, like a voice underwater. "Help! Me!" Peter's pulse jumped. He climbed faster, gripping the handrail so hard his knuckles ached. The voice came again, closer now, but also wrong. There was a hollow echo to it, like it wasn't coming from a human throat. When he reached the top, the lantern room was dark except for the dying light outside. His flashlight swept across broken glass, rusted machinery, and he stopped. In the far corner, half hidden by shadow, something stood. It wasn't Thomas. At least it didn't look like him. The figure was tall, soaked and hunched slightly as if its spine couldn't quite remember how to stand straight. The face was pale, almost luminous, but where the eyes should have been there were only pits of black. Water dripped steadily from its sleeves, forming small pools on the floor. Peter took a step back, his mind scrambling between fight and flight. The thing tilted its head at him, slow and deliberate. Then it spoke, Thomas's voice. "Peter, you shouldn't be here." The words were perfect, but the mouth didn't move. The voice seemed to come from the air itself, vibrating in the metal walls. Peter didn't remember turning to run. He only remembered the stairs, flying past, the cold air, hitting his face, and the lighthouse door slamming shut behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. When he reached the path, breath ragged, he saw something in the distance, a light flicker in the lantern room. Not sweeping, not steady, just pulsing, like a heartbeat. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Peter actually saw what he claimed. Some believe it was exhaustion, the shock of Thomas's disappearance, and the eerie conditions of the lighthouse playing tricks on him. But here's the strange detail that never quite fits. When Peter went back to the docks later that night, the sea mare was gone again, and no one had untied her. By the next morning, the town's rumour mill was running faster than the tide. Word about Peter's encounter at the lighthouse had made its way from the docks to the bakery, to the post office, and by breakfast it was common knowledge. Some scoffed, others whispered about old curses and the Greywater, calling a phrase Peter had never heard before, but which seemed to make the older locals shut their mouths mid-sentence. Peter barely slept. He'd locked his doors, drawn the curtains, and sat in his kitchen nursing a pot of coffee like it was medicine. The image of that figure, the water dripping the black pits for eyes, wouldn't leave him. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Thomas's voice again, hollow and wrong. "You shouldn't be here." At 8 a.m., Sheriff Alden came knocking. The sheriff was a stocky man with a permanent squint, like the sun had gotten into his eyes 40 years ago and never left. He'd heard the story from someone who didn't want to say, which probably meant Martha from the fish market. Alden leaned against Peter's kitchen counter, arms crossed. "You're telling me you went into the lighthouse, which you know is off limits, and saw something that looked like your missing brother?" His voice was flat, but there was a flicker in his eyes, interest maybe, or concern. "That's not what I'm telling you," Peter said. "It didn't just look like him. It wasn't him." Alden let that hang in the air. Then he said, "You know about the disappearances tied to that place." Peter frowned. "Only that people avoid it," the sheriff sighed. 8 missing over the past 70 years, all fishermen, all local, never found. The first was in 1953, a man named Harold Knox. Same night, the old light went dark for good. Folks say something came in with the storm and never left. Peter felt a cold, heavy weight settle in his stomach. "And you think Thomas, I think Thomas is missing?" Alden interrupted, "And you're chasing shadows." Still, he agreed to meet Peter later to check the lighthouse together. They set a time just before dusk when the tide was low and the rocks were visible. Peter tried to distract himself that afternoon, but the town seemed to conspire against him. At the diner, 2 old fishermen at the counter were whispering about the keeper's debt. At the bait shop, a dusty notice board held an old, sun-bleached photo of the lighthouse with a caption that read, "Keep out, paid in blood." No one could explain who had put it there. By the time he met Alden at the trailhead, the sky was a bruised purple and the waves were restless. The sheriff carried a heavy flashlight and an old revolver. "Just in case," he muttered when Peter glanced at it. The climb up felt shorter this time, though Peter couldn't tell if that was because he knew what was ahead or because Alden's steady presence pushed him forward. They reached the top, and Alden pushed open the door without hesitation. The smell hit them instantly, brine, sharper than before. Inside the walls seemed damp, and faint rivulets of water ran down the stone, as if the building itself were sweating. Their footsteps echoed strangely, the sound seeming to curve back toward them. Halfway up the stairs, Peter paused. "Do you hear that?" It was faint, but unmistakable, the dragging sound again. Alden froze. "Stay behind me." They moved slowly, the light from Alden's torch bobbing up the walls. The sound grew louder and Peter's stomach tightened. He gripped the railing, remembering how the thing had tilted its head at him. When they reached the lantern room, the dragging stopped. The space was empty, no figure, no pools of water, just the broken glass and rust. See, Alden said, turning back toward Peter. Nothing here. Peter's eyes caught something in the corner, half hidden under a metal panel. He crouched, reaching for it. It was a small leather pouch soaked through the drawstring tied tight. Inside, wrapped in damp cloth, was a compass. Not just any compass, Thomas's. The initials TB were etched into the back in careful, neat letters. Peter's throat went dry. This was in his cabin on the boat. I saw it yesterday. Before Alden could respond, the lighthouse's door slammed somewhere below them. The sound reverberated up the stairwell like a gunshot, and then the light, dead for decades, flickered to life. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the sudden illumination was mechanical failure or something more. But the strange detail. Every time the beam swung toward the cove, Peter swore he saw a figure standing at the shore, motionless, waiting. The beam of the lighthouse swept the cove in long, deliberate arcs. Each time it passed over the shoreline, Peter's breath caught the silhouette was still there, tall, unmoving, facing the tower. Alden lifted the flashlight, trying to angle it toward the shore, but the glass of the lantern room refracted the beam awkwardly. Could be a rock, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Peter shook his head. Rocks don't stand like that. Without warning, the figure turned and began walking toward the water. The beam of the lighthouse caught it one last time before it stepped into the surf, and then it was gone. No splash, no ripple, just gone. Peter pressed his hand against the cold glass, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. We need to get down there. Alden didn't argue. They descended the winding stairs two at a time, the smell of brine growing overpowering. The sheriff's revolver hung loose in his hand, now his flashlight beam bouncing wildly against the walls. When they burst out into the open air, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the low roar of the tide. The beach below the lighthouse was slick with wet stones and black kelp, but otherwise empty. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Alden's jaw tightened. Let's go back. Peter resisted. No look. He pointed toward the base of the lighthouse. A narrow crevice gaped between the rocks, half hidden by seaweed. The tide had receded just enough to reveal a steep, dark opening. Alden stepped closer, shining his light inside. Sea cave, he said. Most are flooded, but... He hesitated. There's a path. The air from the cave was colder than the night wind, carrying a damp, almost metallic tang. Peter's skin prickled. They ducked inside the stone walls, pressing close on either side. The floor was slick, the sound of water dripping somewhere deep ahead. The further they went, the more Peter felt the pull of something like the air itself was urging him forward. After 20 yards, the tunnel widened into a chamber. Water pooled in the center, black and perfectly still. Against the far wall, in the beam of Alden's light, something glimmered, a chain, bolted into the rock, dangling into the water. Peter crouched beside it. This is rusted. Been here for years. His fingers brushed something smooth in the water. He pulled it up, an old barnacle-crusted oilskin bag. Inside were brittle pages half dissolved from damp. Alden leaned over his shoulder, reading what little was legible. The keeper. Debt must be paid. The sea takes what it is owed. The date at the top read 1953, the year Harold Knox vanished. Suddenly the water in the pool rippled. At first, just a faint disturbance, then a swirl faster and faster, as if something massive was turning beneath the surface. Alden stepped back, raising the revolver instinctively. Peter, we need to go. Before he could finish, a pale hand broke the surface. It was Thomas's hand. Water streamed from his fingers as they gripped the edge of the rock.
Then a face emerged, Thomas's face, but pale eyes, black, as the figure Peter had seen in the lighthouse. His lips moved soundlessly, but Peter swore he heard the words inside his own skull. "You shouldn't have come back." Peter stumbled backward, his heel slipping on the wet stone.
Alden fired once, the sound deafening in the confined space, but the figure was already gone, the water settling as if nothing had happened. The two men stood frozen, the echo of the gunshot fading. From somewhere deep in the tunnel behind them came the sound again, dragging footsteps, slow and deliberate. They weren't alone in the cave anymore. The footsteps grew louder, wet and heavy, like someone dragging boots through seawater. Alden raised the revolver again, but his hands weren't steady anymore. "Who's there?" His voice cracked on the last word, swallowed quickly by the echo of the cave. No answer, just the steady, slow approach. Peter's flashlight beam swept across the jagged rock walls until it caught movement, a shape at the edge of the shadows. It was hunched, its shoulders oddly high, head cocked to one side. Its skin, if it was skin, seemed stretched and translucent, like something pulled too thin. When it stepped forward, Peter's chest tightened. The face was half familiar, like a sketch of someone you've met once but can't quite place. One eye was pale and clouded, the other glistened black. It stopped just outside the pool of light. Water dripped from its fingertips. "You saw him," it rasped. The voice was distorted, like the words were being forced through a throat unused to speaking. Peter's mouth was dry.
"Thomas." The thing's head jerked sharply at the name. Its mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile or a grimace. "Thomas is gone." Before either man could react, the thing lunged not toward them but toward the pool in the center of the chamber. It dropped to its knees, plunging both arms into the water, up to the shoulders, gurgling a sound that was halfway between a chant and a scream. The pool began to swirl again, but this time the water rose, lifting unnaturally in a column that shimmered in the beam of the flashlight. Within the column, shapes formed, faces, dozens of them, pale and wavering mouths open in silent cries. Alden grabbed Peter's arm. "We're leaving. Now!" Peter resisted for one heartbeat too long, transfixed by one of the faces because it looked exactly like the missing lighthouse keeper from 1953. The eyes were pleading, the mouth forming words Peter couldn't hear. A deep rumble reverberated through the stone floor.
The water slammed back down into the pool with a force that splashed over their boots. The figure turned to look at them, water streaming down its face. "You owe the sea," it whispered. That broke Peter's paralysis. They ran, their footsteps and gasps bouncing off the wet rock, the sound of splashing pursuit close behind. The narrow tunnel seemed longer now, as if the darkness was stretching it, keeping the exit just out of reach. When they finally burst out into the night air, the lighthouse beams swept over them like a blessing. The wind was stronger now, carrying the metallic tang of an oncoming storm. They didn't stop until they were halfway up the hill toward the keeper's house. Peter turned back once. The cave mouth was barely visible from here, but for a moment he thought he saw a pale hand resting on the rocks watching them go. And then the beam of the lighthouse passed over it, and it was gone. The keeper's house loomed ahead, its windows dark, the wooden siding groaning softly in the wind. They didn't speak as they approached both, too aware that words might shatter the fragile silence they'd managed to bring with them from the cave. Alden fumbled with the key, cursing under his breath when it stuck in the lock. Peter glanced over his shoulder toward the slope, half expecting to see that pale, hunched figure limping after them. But there was only the restless sea below and the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam. Finally, the door gave way with a reluctant creak, and they stepped inside. The smell hit them first, salt-damp wood and something faintly metallic. The air inside was colder than it should have been, as if the walls had absorbed the chill from outside. Peter's eyes moved to the far wall where an old brass clock ticked unevenly, the second hand skipping every other beat. "Lock it," Alden muttered. Peter slid the bolt into place. His hands were trembling more than he realized. The living room was sparse, 2 armchairs, a coffee table, shelves lined with faded books and logbooks from decades past. On the far wall hung a framed black-and-white photograph, the original Lighthouse crew from 1912. Peter froze. The man in the center, standing stiffly in his pressed uniform, had a face that was unmistakable. It was the same face he'd seen in the swirling water column in the cave. Same pleading eyes, same shape of the jaw. "Alden," he said quietly. Alden followed his gaze and his expression darkened. "That's Elias Boone. Keeper here before the First War. Disappeared during his watch. They said it was an accident, slipped on the rocks during a storm." Peter stepped closer to the photograph. The edges of the glass were fogged on the inside, as though moisture had seeped in long ago and never dried. For a moment, just a moment, he swore the man's eyes shifted to meet his. A low rhythmic thud interrupted his thoughts. It came from upstairs. Alden's head snapped toward the staircase. No one should be up there. The thudding came again, slow, heavy, like someone dragging a piece of furniture or a body. Peter's skin prickled. Could it be Thomas Alden? Shook his head. Thomas wouldn't come here. Not after. He trailed off, glancing toward the window where the lighthouse beam cut across the darkness. The sound stopped. They waited, listening, every muscle tight. The only noise now was the ticking of the faulty clock and the slow hiss of wind pushing against the walls. Then 3 loud knocks from above, spaced evenly apart. Alden didn't wait. He grabbed the lantern from the table, lit it with hands that weren't steady, and started up the stairs. Peter followed against every screaming instinct in his body. The second-floor hallway was narrow, lined with doors on either side. At the far end, the attic hatch hung open, the rope ladder swaying gently. The lantern light barely touched the darkness beyond the hatch. From inside that darkness came a voice, low, wet, and deliberate. "You brought it back." Alden's grip on the lantern tightened. "Who's there?" The voice chuckled, a sound like water sloshing in a barrel. "He's awake now, and he's hungry." The ladder creaked as something began to descend. The lantern flame stuttered as the first pale hand emerged from the darkness above. Its fingers were long skin, stretched too thin, nails blackened and curved like fishhooks. Peter stumbled back, his shoulder knocking against the wall. The thing's other hand appeared, gripping the ladder with deliberate slowness. It was wet, dripping seawater that pattered onto the wooden floor in steady beats. Alden raised the lantern higher, and the light caught its face. It was Elias Boone, only not. The skin hung loose, bloated in some places, sunken in others, like it had been marinating underwater for decades. His eyes were white and clouded, but they moved, tracking them, both the corners, twitching in something like recognition. Peter's breath came sharp. The figure's mouth opened and water spilled out, gurgling as it tried to speak. "You..." "Woke." Before Alden could answer, the figure lunged unnaturally fast for something that looked so decayed. The lantern shattered against the floor, plunging the hallway into darkness, except for the thin spill of moonlight from the window at the end. Peter grabbed Alden's arm and yanked him toward the stairs. Behind them, the wet slap of bare feet hit the wood fast and uneven. Something hissed through the air, a sudden coldness brushing Peter's neck like an unseen hand. They barreled down the steps. Peter nearly lost his footing, but caught the railing just in time. In the dim light, he could see shapes moving on the walls, shadows that didn't belong to them twisting and elongating like tendrils reaching for their ankles. The thing hit the bottom of the stairs with a sound like a sack of meat dropped onto stone. It was on all fours now, its limbs bending wrong joints, popping audibly as it scrambled toward them. Out Alden barked, shoving Peter toward the door. Peter fumbled with the bolt, his fingers slippery with sweat. It stuck again just like earlier. The thing's breath was suddenly at his ear, reeking of brine and rot. He didn't dare turn around. The bolt finally gave. They threw themselves out into the night, the door slamming shut behind them with a bang that echoed over the water. They didn't stop running until they reached the lighthouse steps. The beams swept across their faces, and in that flash of light, Peter saw something horrifying. Elias Boone was already halfway across the yard, moving like the tide itself was pushing him forward. Alden shoved the lighthouse door open, and they slammed it behind them. But even with the door shut, the sound followed the slow, deliberate knock, knock, knock on the wood, and then silence. Peter realized they were both panting like they'd run for miles. He looked at Alden, who was staring at the thick wooden door with wide, unblinking eyes. That Alden whispered, "is not the worst thing out here tonight." The knocking stopped, but the quiet that replaced it wasn't relief. It was worse. It felt expectant. Peter's pulse was still hammering in his ears when the first vibration came through the lighthouse floor. A low, rolling tremor, almost like the structure itself was breathing in. Alden's hand shot to the lantern hook by the wall, but when he lit it, the flame burned a sickly green. It hissed, spitting tiny sparks that curled upward like drifting plankton. "That's the tide change," Alden muttered, but his voice was too tight, too quick. "We have maybe 30 seconds before it comes up through the stones." It, Peter echoed. The answer came before Alden could speak. From beneath them, something scraped the rock foundation. The sound was deep and metallic like a ship's anchor chain being pulled across coral, only it kept going, circling, tightening. The walls began to sweat. Not condensation, actual seawater seeping from the mortar in thin threads that ran down to the floor. The smell was pure rot, clinging to the back of Peter's throat. A sudden thud rattled the base of the lighthouse, nearly knocking him off balance. Another came harder, and a hairline crack zigzagged up the far wall. Through it he saw a pale, unblinking eye staring in. It wasn't Boone. This eye was too large, its iris the color of bleached bone, with tiny black shapes swimming in it like minnows trapped under ice. Then the stone gave way. Something like a tentacle, but jointed like a centipede, forced its way through the gap, its surface armored in barnacles that snapped open and shut like tiny mouths. It lashed toward Peter, catching his coat sleeve and tearing fabric with a wet rip. Alden yanked him back toward the spiral stairs. They took the steps 2 at a time, the thing's segmented length clattering against the walls as it followed. The green lantern light below twisted and warped as the creature's bulk blocked it, leaving them in flickering shadow. By the time they reached the upper platform, Peter's lungs were on fire. He could hear the wind screaming outside waves, hammering the rocks below, but that wasn't what froze his blood. The creature's head rose into view through the hatch. It had no mouth, only a circular ridge lined with pulsating fronds that flexed and curled as if tasting the air. Alden grabbed the emergency flare from the wall, cracked it, and jammed the burning tip down toward the thing's face. It recoiled with a hiss, like steam hitting hot iron, retreating halfway down the stairwell, but not leaving. Peter leaned against the railing, his voice shaking. "What the hell is it?" Alden didn't look at him. He was staring down the darkened stairwell with an expression Peter hadn't seen yet tonight. Not fear, not shock, just grim recognition. "It's the one that calls them," Alden said quietly. Boone was just answering. Below in the dark, something began to climb again. The first clang of the creature's shell against the stairwell rang like a bell inside Peter's skull. It was coming up fast. Alden didn't waste time. He yanked open the rusted emergency locker on the upper deck and shoved a coil of rope into Peter's arms. "Tie it off to the railing. If we stay in here, we're dead." Peter's throat went dry. Outside, in this storm, lightning flashed through the glass panes around them, revealing a wall of rain and the roiling sea below. Waves were smashing against the rocks so hard that bursts of white foam rose almost level with the deck. But the alternative, staying inside, was climbing toward them, joint by joint. The flare in Alden's other hand was burning low, hissing in the damp air. Below, the sound of the creature's plates grinding against the stair rail was joined by something else, a wet, rhythmic thump. Peter realized it was more limbs joining the climb. "Move," Alden barked. Peter's fingers fumbled with the rope, looping it twice around the thickest section of railing. The wind slammed into him like a wall when Alden wrenched open the exterior hatch. For a split second, the world was nothing but darkness, salt, and the deafening roar of the sea. The rain was horizontal. Each drop stung like a needle as Peter followed Alden out onto the slick metal catwalk that circled the lantern room. The lighthouse swayed subtly under their feet, as if bracing against the waves hammering its base. Alden clipped the rope to his belt, shoved the other end at Peter, and pointed toward the seaward side. "We go down the outside."
"Slow is dead. Hold on, and don't look down." Behind them, the hatch shook violently. A claw, if you could call it that, hooked through the gap. It was jointed, ending in a cluster of finger-like projections tipped with ridged pads, each one gripping the metal with a wet squeal. Lightning lit the whole scene for an instant. Alden's grim face, the slick, black surface of the lighthouse wall, the endless abyss of the ocean beyond, and in that flash, Peter saw more shapes moving in the water. Something else was circling the base. Several somethings. They swung themselves over the railing. Peter's boots skidded against the wet metal rungs, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the rope. The wind was an unrelenting hand shoving at his back. Alden went first, descending in short shore bursts, his coat flapping violently. A piercing screech tore through the storm from above. The creature had reached the lantern deck.
It slammed against the railing, sending vibrations down through the rope and into Peter's arms. Then it leaned over its faceless head, scanning the side of the lighthouse until it found them. It began to follow. Peter's foot slipped rope, burning his palms as he slid 1/2 meter before catching himself. "It's coming down!" he shouted, his voice ripped apart by the wind. I know Alden's voice was raw, barely audible. "Get ready to jump when I say!" Below them, the black water surged closer with each drop, but Peter could see a jagged ledge just above the waveline, a potential landing point if they timed it with the lull between swells. The rope jerked violently. Above, the creature had grabbed hold, its many limbs moving in eerie synchronization as it began hand over hand down the same line they were on. Now Alden bellowed. They let go. Peter hit the ledge in a crouch that sent shocks of pain through his knees, Alden rolling beside him. A wave exploded against the rocks, drenching them instantly and almost sweeping them away, but they clung to the slick surface. The rope above snapped, not from strain, from being bitten. The last thing Peter saw before the next wave crashed over them was the creature coiling its segmented body over the railing like a serpent preparing to strike. The ledge was barely wider than Peter's boots, slick with seaweed and glistening from the relentless spray. Every few seconds, another wave slammed into the rocks, surging up to their waists before draining back into the churning black water. Alden grabbed Peter's sleeve and hauled him close, shouting over the storm. "There's a cave 30 meters that way. Hug the wall." "Don't let the swell take you." Peter followed his gaze. Through the blur of rain and salt, a dark fissure gaped in the cliff face like the open mouth of something waiting. The only way to reach it was along a jagged, narrow path that dipped dangerously low, in places low enough that each passing wave could easily pull them under. Behind them the sound came again. That wet, jointed clatter of too many limbs moving over metal. The creature was descending the outside of the lighthouse, unhurried but inevitable, its silhouette occasionally illuminated by lightning. Alden went first, pressing his back to the wall, inching sideways. Peter tried to mimic his movements, but every slippery foothold felt like a trap. His pulse thundered in his ears, almost drowning out the roar of the storm almost. Halfway across, a wave struck hard enough to lift Peter's feet from the ledge. His hands scrambled for purchase fingernails, scraping barnacles. Alden lunged, catching him by the collar and yanking him back to the wall. "Move!" They pushed on the cave, growing larger, the shadows inside thick and impenetrable. A sudden, inhuman screech ripped through the air. Peter glanced back and saw the creature had reached the base of the lighthouse, crouched like a spider, before launching itself onto the ledge. It didn't slither or crawl, it bounded the impact of each landing, sending tremors through the rock. Alden shoved Peter toward the cave entrance. Inside now. The transition from storm to darkness was instant and suffocating. The air inside the cave was heavy with the smell of salt rot and something coppery. Peter fumbled for his flashlight, the beam flickering to life and cutting a narrow cone through the black. The cave walls were slick, narrowing in some places so much they had to turn sideways to pass. Their footsteps echoed oddly, as if the sound didn't travel evenly. Somewhere deeper inside, water dripped in a slow, steady rhythm that didn't match the storm outside. They pushed deeper until the sound of the waves dulled. The passage bent sharply, revealing a chamber where the walls glittered faintly in the beam minerals, or salt deposits maybe. In the center of the chamber was something else entirely, a crude, waist-high stone structure, circular, with strange etchings worn into its surface. Peter stepped closer, tracing one with his finger. These aren't random. They look like coordinates. Before Alden could answer, a sound echoed from the tunnel they'd just left, something sliding over wet stone getting closer. They had seconds. Alden grabbed Peter's arm and pulled him toward a low crawl space at the back of the chamber. "It's tight, but it might lead out." "Go!" Peter squeezed into the gap rock, scraping his shoulders. The space was so narrow he could barely breathe without his chest brushing stone. Behind him, Alden followed the creature's approach, now accompanied by that wet, clicking sound they'd first heard in the lighthouse stairwell. Then the scraping stopped. For one heartbeat there was only silence. A single, slender limb slid into the crawl space after them, feeling along the walls like it was learning their shape. Peter's breath caught. Alden whispered, almost inaudible, "Don't move!" The crawl space was a coffin stone, pressing against Peter's ribs, cold and wet, the air stinking of brine and rot. The limb inched farther in, jointed like an insect's, but glistening like a sea creature's tentacle. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if savoring the approach. Peter's instinct screamed to move, but Alden's hand pressed hard against his ankle, a silent command to stay still. The thing's claw or hook, or whatever it was, tapped along the wall beside Peter's head. The sound was impossibly loud in the confined space, like metal on bone. A drop of seawater, or maybe not seawater, splashed onto Peter's cheek. It was warm. The limb retreated a few inches, then halted, twitching in a slow rhythm, almost like it was smelling the air. Then, with a sudden jerk, it scraped along the floor toward Peter's boot. He couldn't help it, his legs spasmed away. The movement was small, but enough. The limb shot forward, latching onto his ankle with shocking strength. A slick, barbed grip dug into his skin through the fabric. Peter shouted, the sound trapped between the rock walls. Alden lunged, driving his elbow hard into the thing's limb. It shrieked a sound so high-pitched it rattled Peter's skull and recoiled, vanishing into the black behind them. But the reprieve was short. They heard it retreat only a meter before something heavier joined it. Multiple limbs. Alden's voice was low, but urgent. "Move! Now!" Peter wriggled forward, scraping the knees and elbows raw on the jagged stone. The crawl space narrowed again, forcing him to exhale completely, just to squeeze through. His chest felt like it was collapsing. His flashlight beam jittered wildly with each movement, throwing monstrous shadows against the damp rock. Behind them the sound came again, scraping, clattering, a low gurgle that didn't sound human or animal. The tunnel seemed to amplify it, feeding it straight into Peter's ears. A gust of air hit his face from ahead, cool, fresh, faintly tinged with salt. An exit. He clawed forward faster, ignoring the pain in his knees, until the rock dropped away beneath him. He almost tumbled head-first out of the crawl space, catching himself just in time on the ledge. They had emerged into a hollow under the cliff, open to the sea through a jagged moor. Rain lashed the opening waves, bursting against the rocks below. Alden slid out beside him, breathing hard. "We've got two choices: climb up those rocks into the storm, or—" He looked down where a narrow gap led deeper under the cliff, the darkness beyond swallowing the flashlight beam. "Or see where that goes." Peter hesitated, every instinct telling him that staying near the sea meant staying near it. But the sound from the crawl space made the decision for him. It was coming again, faster this time. They scrambled down into the lower gap water, pooling around their boots. The tunnel here was taller but curved in strange, unnatural ways, as though something massive had bored through the rock long ago. Just as the light faded from the storm outside, Peter's flashlight caught movement ahead, something pale, human-shaped, standing just around the bend. It didn't move. It stood motionless, half-turned toward them, its outline ghostly in the wavering flashlight beam. Water dripped from its hair, pooling around bare, pale feet that looked almost translucent. Peter froze mid-step. Alden's hand shot out instinctively, barring him from moving forward. The figure's head tilted ever so slightly, too slowly to be natural, until its gaze fixed directly on them. The face was unmistakable even through the years. "Clara." Peter's voice was no louder than the rain echoing from outside. Clara missing for 14 years, since she vanished from Greywater's summer market one bright afternoon. Her disappearance had been one of the town's oldest wounds. And yet here she was, or something, wearing her face in a tunnel under the Lighthouse cliffs. Her lips parted. The sound that came out was wrong, layered as if more than one voice spoke through her. "You!" came back. Alden took a step forward despite himself, his eyes flicking to Peter. She was 6 when she vanished. This isn't possible. Clara moved closer. The tunnel was so narrow that every step she took felt like the walls themselves were tightening. Her skin was a shade too pale, almost luminous in the dark, and small ridges ran along her neck like faint scars or gills. Peter's voice cracked. "Clara, it's me." "Peter, what happened to you?" Her eyes widened, but not with recognition, with hunger. In one fluid, inhuman motion, she was inches from them, water flying from her hair in cold sprays. her hands clamped on Peter's shoulders, not squeezing, just holding, like she was studying the shape of him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, but the words were drowned by the sound of something behind her, heavy, dragging, multi-limbed. Alden grabbed Peter's arm, yanking him backward. Clara's grip tightened, her fingers pressing in with unnatural strength. "They'll take you too," she hissed. And then they saw it emerging from the bend behind her, the same limb they'd seen in the crawl space, now accompanied by a grotesque hulking shape dripping seawater, its many eyes reflecting the flashlight like shards of glass. Clara turned to face it, her body shifting into a defensive stance, almost protecting them. Peter's mind reeled. Was she an ally or part of the nightmare? The creature bellowed a sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. Clara looked back at them one last time. "Run." They did. Boots splashing through rising water, they fled deeper into the tunnel, the light dancing wildly as Peter struggled to keep his footing. Behind them, the sounds of a struggle filled the air, thrashing, shrieking bone against rock. The tunnel curved again, then dropped into a cavern so vast that their flashlights couldn't find the ceiling. The sound of the sea was everywhere, yet no opening was visible. In the center, something gleamed, a rusted metal door set into the rock, bolted shut with chains. Alden's voice was hoarse. "We're not supposed to find this." And from behind the door came a steady, deliberate knocking. The knocking was deliberate, 3 taps, a pause, then 2. Over and over again, not frantic, not desperate, just patient. Peter's breath came in short, uneven bursts. Someone's in there. Alden didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the rusted chains binding the door, their links pitted with salt and corrosion. The metal wasn't old in the way of forgotten ruins. It looked maintained, as if someone made sure it never fully rotted away. The cavern smelled of iron and brine, thick enough to coat the back of the throat. Every few seconds the knocking stopped, only to start again with mechanical precision. Peter stepped closer. "We have to open it!" "No!" Alden snapped the word harsh in the damp air. If there's one thing I've learned in Greywater, it's that locked doors under the sea are locked for a reason. The knocking ceased. For several heartbeats there was only the distant echo of dripping water. Then a voice, muffled but unmistakably human. "Peter!" Peter's blood ran cold. That voice didn't just sound like Clara, it was Clara. She was behind the door. Or something wanted them to believe she was. Alden grabbed his arm. "It's not her. We just saw her." "She's a sound," cut him off a roar from the tunnel behind them. The creature was coming. The stone walls trembled faintly with each thundering step. Peter's gaze darted between the approaching darkness and the chained door. "We can't fight that thing." Alden's jaw tightened. And what if opening that door is worse than facing it? The voice behind the door spoke again, softer this time. "Help me, please." "They took me. I'm still me." The creature's shadow filled the tunnel mouth. Its many eyes glinted in the flashlight beam, each reflecting the 2 men standing cornered. The decision was made for them. Peter lunged for the chains, pulling a crowbar from his backpack. The rust groaned as he pried the first link apart. The knocking became urgent now, almost frantic, as if whatever was inside could sense its release. Alden swore under his breath, joining in despite himself. Link after link snapped or twisted free, the air in the cavern growing colder with every break. Finally, the last chain fell away. The creature roared, charging. Peter shoved the heavy door inward, and the cavern exploded with blinding silver-blue light. It wasn't like daylight or lantern fire. It was ocean light, rippling, shifting, alive. Through the glare, Peter thought he saw shapes on the other side. Not human, not entirely. Figures tall and thin, their faces hidden, their movements inhumanly fluid, as though they were swimming through the air itself. The roar behind them cut short, replaced by a strange, keening sound. The creature stopped at the threshold, quivering like a predator, suddenly faced with a greater one. One of the figures stepped forward, its hand, or something like a hand, reaching for Peter. And then Clara's voice again, "You came back for me." Peter's vision swam. His last thought before the light swallowed them was that he wasn't sure if that was gratitude or accusation. When Peter's eyes opened, the first thing he noticed was the silence, not the muffled kind you get underwater, or the dead hush of a sleeping town. This was the absolute absence of sound, the kind that makes your own heartbeat feel deafening. He was lying on a smooth, pale floor. Alden was next to him, sprawled on his back, breathing but unconscious. They weren't in the cavern anymore. The walls around them glowed faintly as though lit from within the illumination, rippling like sunlight on the ocean floor. No seams, no doors, just endless curved surfaces. Peter pushed himself up, every movement slow, wary. A shadow moved in the glow. It was Clara, or something that looked like her. Her face was pale, her hair slicked back as if she'd just surfaced from deep water. She smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it, only recognition and something harder to read. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice carrying perfectly in the soundless air. Peter swallowed. "We were trying to find you." "You found me," she replied, stepping closer. "But not the me you remember." Behind her, other figures began to appear tall, impossibly thin, their features obscured by that same shimmering distortion he'd glimpsed before. They didn't walk so much as glide their limbs, moving with slow, deliberate precision. Alden stirred, groaning as he sat up. His eyes went wide. Peter. Where the hell he stopped when he saw the things surrounding them. One of the figures extended its hand toward Alden, palm up. Its fingers were long, jointed, strangely webbed between. The gesture was almost human. Clara looked between the two men. "They've been here long before your lighthouse, long before Greywater. They take what belongs to the sea, and sometimes what doesn't." Peter's voice shook. "And you," her eyes softened for the briefest moment. "I belong to them now." A sound like rushing water filled the air, though the walls didn't move. It came from inside Peter's skull, pressing against his thoughts. Images flashed, ships breaking apart on unseen reefs, divers vanishing into darkness, the beam of the Greywater lighthouse sweeping over empty waves. He stumbled back, clutching his head. Alden grabbed his arm, but Clara stepped forward. "Go," she whispered. "While they still allow it." Peter looked at her, his chest tight. "Come with us." Clara's expression froze. "If I did, the sea would come for you, and it wouldn't stop." The rushing sound grew louder. The figures closed in, not threatening, but final. Alden's voice was hoarse. "Peter, now!" The glow around them brightened to a blinding white, and in an instant the floor dropped away. They were falling, choking on cold air, and then they were on the rocks at the base of the lighthouse, coughing, shivering, soaked to the bone. The storm had passed the sea, calm as glass. There was no sign of the cavern, no door, no chains. The lighthouse beam swept slowly over the water. Peter stared out at the horizon, his jaw tight. He could still hear the knocking in the back of his mind. Alden muttered, "We're never telling anyone about this." "Are we?" Peter didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the calm waves, watching for the ripple of movement beneath. He knew it wasn't over. The waves rolled in, soft and steady, now the kind of calm that fishermen mistrust because it never lasts. From the shore, Greywater Cove looked exactly as it had 100 years ago. The lighthouse kept its watch, the gulls wheeled overhead, and the small town behind it carried on as if nothing had shifted. But Peter knew better. Somewhere out there, past the reach of the beam, something was waiting. Something older than the town, older than the stone the lighthouse stood on. He could feel it every time he closed his eyes, a flicker of pale light beneath the water, a slow and patient rhythm that wasn't the tide. The locals would tell the story for years. They'd say the storm was bad, that it rattled nerves and blurred memory. They'd nod when he spoke of exhaustion, dehydration, or a fall on the rocks. But none of them would believe what really happened under the cove. And maybe that was for the best. Still late at night, when the fog draped over Greywater like a shroud, Peter would stand at the rail of the lighthouse and stare into the dark. If the wind shifted just right, he could almost hear her voice. Go while they still allow it. He never knew if it was a warning or an invitation. The next storm was coming, and Greywater Cove would remember.